The lesson.
As you can see,
The hall of the
immense
Galactic
pressure
Academy was
builds
vast and
until the
shaped like a
molten
dome
rock
of silver
finds
light,
its way to the
filled with
surface.
voices from 100 worlds and 1,000 different languages, woven together into a hum of restless anticipation. Young cadets of every species sat at long curved benches, their eyes fixed upon the ancient professor who stood at the center dais. He was a scaled being of the Kareth species, his robes draped with glowing glyphs of authority, and his voice was amplified across the chamber by crystalline spheres that floated above him. Today's lesson was meant to remind every cadet of the fragility of life when placed against the power of hostile planets. He raised his claw, and with a flick of his hand the air shimmered, displaying a rotating sphere of blue and green wrapped in a haze of white cloud. The name of the planet glowed in the ancient tongue above it, a name whispered in dread across countless civilizations: Earth. The professor's voice rolled out like thunder as he declared that this was no ordinary world but a living tomb where mountains bled fire, where seas rose to swallow cities, and where storms howled like beasts for months without rest. He told the cadets that Earth was the cruelest cradle ever imagined by the stars, and that no being in their right mind would dare step upon its surface. The chamber grew tense as murmurs spread through the benches. The insectoid Jarek leaned toward her companion, her mandibles clicking nervously as she asked how any species could possibly survive such violence. The amphibious Relari coiled its frilled neck, whispering that it was impossible, that such tales had to be exaggerations, or myths designed to frighten younglings into obedience. The professor let them murmur before raising his hand again, silencing the hall. He described rivers of molten stone that poured from mountain peaks as though the world itself were wounded in bleeding fire. He spoke of quakes that tore the land apart, opening endless abysses into which whole civilizations could vanish. He described beasts with fangs longer than a warrior's sword, and predators with patience and cunning that could outlast any hunter in the galaxy. Earth, he declared, was a place of constant death where survival was a coin flip with every sunrise. For a moment the lecture held them all in its grip. Even the most arrogant cadets who had mocked other worlds fell quiet. They shifted uneasily, their eyes locked on the image of the world that spun above them, half covered in storm clouds. Then from the far back of the hall a sound cut through the silence. It was a low chuckle, then louder, rolling into laughter. All heads turned at once. A single human sat in the rear bench, arms crossed over his chest, a crooked smile spread across his face as if he had just heard the funniest tale in the galaxy. His laughter echoed across the chamber, and every alien face turned pale with confusion and unease. The professor froze, his scaled brow furrowed as he stared at the young human cadet. The alien students began to whisper in outrage, some in fear. The insectoid Jarek hissed that he must have gone mad, for how could anyone laugh at such horror? The Relari shook its head, insisting it was an insult to the Academy to treat such warnings as a joke. Others demanded silence and respect, but the human only leaned back, his laughter subsiding into a calm grin. The professor raised his voice and demanded to know what was so amusing about a world described as death incarnate. The human did not bow his head or offer an apology. Instead, he shrugged with an ease that unsettled the entire hall. He said that they spoke of volcanoes as if they were curses, of storms as if they were unendurable, of predators as if they were demons. To him, these were not nightmares but memories of home, sights that he and his people had grown up with since the dawn of their existence. His words carried a tone that was not boastful but casual, as if describing nothing out of the ordinary. The chamber trembled with whispers again. The professor narrowed his eyes, his voice sharp as a blade as he told the cadet to explain himself. Every gaze locked on the human, waiting for his answer, waiting to see if this laughter was madness or truth. The air in the academy seemed to thicken as silence fell once more, and for the first time the myths of Earth did not feel like distant legends told to frighten children, but something alive, something real, something standing in their very classroom, smiling as if the dangers of a world of fire and storm were nothing more than the jokes of frightened children. The stage was set, and the galaxy would never look at Earth the same way again. The mockery. The silence after the human's laughter lingered like a heavy shadow across the hall. Every cadet stared, some in shock, some in disgust, and some with a creeping unease that slithered down their spines. The professor's gaze stayed fixed on the human as though his eyes alone could burn away the insolence of such a reaction, yet the cadet showed no fear. Instead, he looked around the hall with a calmness that unsettled the alien students more than any outburst could have. The insectoid Jarek clicked her mandibles furiously and demanded to know what madness possessed him to mock the warnings of the academy. Others quickly joined her, their voices rising in a storm of accusations. One claimed that the human was attempting to prove himself superior. Another muttered that he was lying and that no species could thrive on such a cursed rock. The amphibious Relari raised its frilled neck high and spoke with a trembling voice, saying that if what the human said was true, then perhaps humanity itself was an aberration of nature, something forged in torment rather than born of balance. The professor silenced them with a wave of his claw, but the damage was already done. The cadets had tasted the fear of doubt, and it clung to their voices as they muttered to one another. All of them turned to the human, waiting for his reply. The professor leaned forward on the dais, his scaled lips curling as he commanded the human to answer. Why did he laugh at tales of such terror? Why did he treat warnings of annihilation as humor? What truth did he believe he held that justified his mockery? The human sat still for a moment, then leaned forward with his arms resting on the bench. His smile was faint now, replaced with a calm seriousness that carried through his voice as he began to speak. He told them that what they called horror and doom was simply life as he and his kind had always known it. Mountains did bleed fire, yes, but to humans they were called volcanoes, and their eruptions were both feared and studied, bringing destruction but also new land and fertile soil that fed their crops. Storms did howl for weeks, tearing at coastlines and drowning cities, but his people had learned to rebuild stronger and faster, their communities standing against winds that could strip stone from the ground. Earthquakes shattered homes, yet they adapted by shaping their buildings to sway with the trembling of the planet, instead of resisting it until they broke. Predators with teeth as long as arms had stalked the forests and plains, but humanity had fought them with fire, with cunning, with teamwork until they became legends rather than masters. The cadets shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered that it was impossible, that no species could endure so many trials and thrive. Yet the human's tone remained steady, without anger or arrogance. He said that what they considered madness was simply the ordinary rhythm of his world. Children grew up in the shadow of fire mountains, their lullabies mixed with the rumble of the earth. Families lived on coastlines that were always at war with the ocean, and still they built their homes and their futures. Humanity did not merely survive these trials, they grew stronger because of them. One cadet, a scaled noble of the Zirath, stood and sneered openly, declaring that the human was a liar. No being could live with such endless danger without being broken. He called the laughter an insult to the academy, a sign of disrespect for knowledge and tradition. His voice rang with arrogance as he accused the human of spinning myths to glorify his species. A ripple of agreement spread through some of the benches, though not all. There were those who had felt the weight of truth in the human's calm explanation, and though they tried to dismiss it, a seed of doubt had already been planted. The professor spoke again, his voice slow and heavy, pressing the human further. If what he said was true, then why did he laugh? Why mock the fear of others? Why find amusement in warnings meant to preserve life? The human leaned back again, his gaze sweeping over the assembly. He said he laughed not out of disrespect, but because the way they spoke of Earth was like frightened children whispering about shadows without ever stepping into the dark. They saw doom, but he saw home. They saw fire as death. He saw it as warmth and rebirth. They saw storms as madness. He saw them as challenges that his people had always met. His laughter came from the distance between their fear and his reality. The words settled over the chamber like a storm cloud. The cadets were split between those who refused to believe and those who could not deny the quiet certainty in the human's voice. The professor himself said nothing, his clawed hand gripping the edge of the dais as though the weight of this revelation pressed upon him. The laughter that had begun as an insult was now something far greater, a rift between what the galaxy believed about Earth and what one human had revealed as truth. The class had come expecting to be warned of death worlds, but instead they found themselves staring at one of its children, alive, calm, and unshaken, and the unease that followed was deeper than fear itself. The explanation. The professor remained standing in the center of the great hall, his scaled face unreadable though his eyes glimmered with an intensity that revealed both doubt and curiosity. The cadets sat in restless silence, shifting in their seats as the humans' words echoed within their minds. They had been raised to believe that Earth was nothing more than a story told to frighten the young, a cursed place where life could never flourish. Yet here sat one of its children speaking with calm certainty, as though all their lessons had been little more than rumors. The professor finally gestured for the human to stand and speak fully to the class. His voice carried the weight of command as he demanded that if humanity truly endured such nightmares, then he must explain in detail how such survival was even possible. The human rose slowly, his posture relaxed, his expression unshaken by the countless eyes fixed upon him. His voice was not loud, yet every word carried to the farthest corners of the chamber. He began by describing the mountains of his world, peaks that reached so high they cut into the skies themselves. Beneath these peaks churned rivers of molten stone, and from time to time the pressure of the planet's heart forced that molten fury to the surface. The eruptions leveled towns, burned forests, and reshaped the land, but his people had never abandoned those regions. Instead, they studied the patterns, they learned to predict the signs, they built communities that could flee when the mountains rumbled, and when the land cooled they found the soil richer than before. What the galaxy feared as unending fire, his people treated as a cycle of destruction and renewal. He moved on to the oceans, vast waters that covered most of the world. He explained how the tides rose and fell with the pull of the moon, and how storms could swell the seas into towering walls that devoured coastlines. Entire fleets were once lost to tempests, yet the oceans were also highways of trade and discovery. His people had sailed into the unknown, guided only by the stars, surviving weeks and months on fragile vessels, often at the mercy of the elements. They faced hurricanes that could shatter ships like toys, and still they returned, bringing stories, maps, and connections that would bind continents together. The cadets listened in silence now, their earlier mockery replaced by a growing unease. The humans' words were not exaggerated boasts. They carried the weight of experience, delivered without pride, only with the matter-of-fact tone of one describing the world he had always known. He spoke of earthquakes, how the very crust of Earth trembled and cracked without warning. Entire cities had fallen in moments, yet his people rebuilt again and again. They did not surrender to the shifting ground, but adapted their structures to bend and sway, turning disaster into an engineer's challenge rather than a god's punishment. Then he described the living threats, predators with teeth and claws built for killing. He told of great cats that stalked the night with eyes that glowed in darkness, of reptiles armored in scales that could snap bone with a single bite, of insects carrying venom that could kill with a sting. His people were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most armored, yet they had fire and they had wit. They made tools, they hunted in groups, and slowly they learned to turn the hunters into the hunted. The cadets shivered as he spoke, realizing that Earth had not merely tested humanity with nature's fury, but had pitted them against other apex creatures in a constant struggle for survival. The professor interjected, asking how such endless dangers had not driven humanity into extinction long before it reached the stars. The human looked at him calmly and said that the answer was simple. They adapted. Every trial sharpened them. Every loss taught them. Every challenge forged resilience. Where other species sought stability, humanity had been forced to grow in chaos. They never saw their world as a curse, but as the only home they had ever known. To them, the storms were not punishment, but part of life. The predators, not demons, but rivals. The fire, not death, but warmth. The hall was silent when he finished, the image of Earth still spinning above them as if daring the galaxy to question its cruelty. The cadets who had once mocked him now struggled with a truth that gnawed at their certainty. The myths had painted Earth as uninhabitable, yet here was proof in flesh and bone that its children not only survived, but thrived. The human's calm explanation struck deeper than any boast could have, for it revealed a species that did not just endure hardship, but accepted it as natural as breathing. The unease in the chamber was no longer about the planet itself, but about the kind of beings it had created, and the realization that one of them now stood among them left a chill in every heart. The fear. The professor dismissed the image of Earth from the air, but the silence it left behind was heavier than before. The cadets did not whisper now. They sat frozen, their minds turning over the words of the human and the meaning hidden beneath them. For years they had been taught that strength came from careful breeding or long tradition of war, or the blessings of calm and stable planets that allowed societies to flourish in peace. Yet this human stood as proof that strength could also be carved out of chaos and hardship, that survival itself could become the forge of power. The insectoid Jarek lowered her mandibles and drew back from the human, as if she were sitting too close to something dangerous. The amphibious R'Lari shifted uneasily, its frills quivering with nervous pulses of color. Even the proud Zirath noble who had mocked the human earlier now watched with narrowed eyes, his expression no longer sneering but cautious. The professor spoke again, his voice quieter than before, as though he too felt the weight of the revelation. He admitted to the class that Earth had always been considered a myth in galactic records, a death world spoken of in stories to warn younglings of the dangers that lurked in the wider universe. Never had he expected one of its children to stand before him alive and unshaken. He told the cadets that they must take this lesson seriously, for it revealed that the galaxy held more mysteries than even the Council dared to admit. His words should have reassured them, but instead they spread more unease. If Earth was real, then everything they thought they knew of safety and danger was uncertain. Around the chamber the whispers began again, but these whispers carried fear rather than mockery. If Earth was truly as the human described, then what sort of beings had it created? If one human cadet could laugh at stories that terrified entire academies, what could an army of them accomplish? Some muttered that humanity must be outlawed before they spread further. Others suggested they should be studied like dangerous beasts behind containment fields. A few spoke softly that perhaps humanity could become allies. Yet even these voices were hesitant, as if to befriend such a species was to invite fire into one's home. The human watched all of this without anger, his face calm, his eyes steady. That calmness unsettled the cadets even more. He did not need to raise his voice or boast of power. His very existence, his very composure in the face of their fear, carried more weight than any declaration could. Finally he spoke, his tone level and even, telling them that they misunderstood his laughter. It had never been meant to insult them. He said he laughed because they spoke of his home as if it were a curse, but to him it had always been a place of beauty as much as danger. He told them that volcanoes looked like towers of fire painting the sky, that storms sounded like drums of the earth calling out to the living, that predators taught his people to be cunning and strong. He reminded them that Earth was not just a place of death but also of life, filled with forests and rivers, with skies that burned with color at sunrise and sunset. Yet his words did not bring peace. For many cadets, the thought that such dangers could be seen as ordinary or even beautiful was far more terrifying than the dangers themselves. It meant that humanity's mind had been shaped by things that would drive others to madness. It meant that they did not see fear where others saw it. To live beside storms and fire and predators and not merely endure them but embrace them suggested a resilience that no other species could match. The professor himself seemed troubled, his hand gripping his staff tightly as though he were holding back questions that would change more than just the lesson of the day. The fear spread beyond the classroom. By the end of the cycle, the story of the laughing human was already moving through the corridors of the academy. Cadets from other classes whispered that Earth's child sat among them, smiling while tales of death were spoken aloud. Rumors twisted quickly, some claiming that humans drank fire or ate storms, others insisting that they were immune to pain itself. The human said nothing to deny or confirm the rumors. He carried himself through the halls as he always had, calm and steady. But now every step left a ripple of unease. What had begun as a lesson about myths had become the seed of something far larger. The galaxy had long thought Earth a story, a symbol of ultimate danger, but now the myth walked in flesh. The cadets realized they were no longer dealing with stories told by elders, but with the truth of a species that had endured what no others could. That truth was heavier than any weapon, heavier than any warning, and though no battle had been fought yet, the fear was already a kind of defeat. The challenge. The academy could not contain the rumors for long. By the next rotation, the whispers had reached the ears of the faculty council, and even the senior officers who trained future commanders of fleets. The tale of the human who laughed at Earth's horrors was repeated with growing exaggeration. Some said he had mocked the storms that could strip skin from bone, others that he claimed to wrestle predators as a child, and still others swore he had survived rivers of molten rock. The truth was simpler yet more unsettling. He had laughed because he had lived what they feared. The council summoned the professor, demanding to know if the account was true. He confirmed what had been witnessed, though he admitted that even he could not be certain how much of the human's claims reflected literal truth or simply a hardened perspective shaped by culture. Yet the fact remained undeniable. A human lived among them, and his view of Earth was not one of horror but of home. The council debated in private chambers, their voices heated as they considered the implications. Some argued the human should be sent away, perhaps even returned to his people where he could not unsettle the academy. Others believed the galaxy needed to understand what such a species could truly endure. In the end, the decision was made that if humanity was to be trusted within the interstellar community, their resilience must be tested openly. The academy would arrange a demonstration. If the human spoke the truth, he would prove it before all. News of the challenge spread quickly through the cadets. The Zirath noble, who had once mocked him, now strode the halls with renewed pride. He claimed it was his own demand for proof that had led to this trial, and he relished the chance to see the human humbled. The insectoid Zarek hissed her disapproval, muttering that no simulation could ever match the descriptions the human gave. But she kept her doubts quiet. The Relari remained silent, its wide eyes following the human as though studying a strange predator. Among them all, the human walked without visible concern. When approached and told of the trial, he only shrugged and said he would participate. He warned them that their machines could not capture the reality of Earth, but if they needed proof, then he would not refuse. The day of the challenge drew crowds. The great dome of the Academy's simulation chamber was filled with cadets, instructors, and observers from outside. The walls shimmered with pale energy, ready to shape themselves into whatever trial the council commanded. The professor stood with the counselors at the high dais, his expression caught between pride and worry. The human stepped into the chamber with no armor, no weapon, only the training uniform of a cadet. His presence alone silenced the hall. The council announced the stages of the trial. He would face simulations drawn from records of Earth's most extreme environments, reconstructed from ancient data archives. First would come the storms, winds strong enough to lift a being from the ground and rains that cut like knives. Then the quakes, the shaking earth tearing apart stone beneath his feet. Then the predators, reconstructed from fossil records, creatures larger and stronger than anything the cadets had ever seen. Finally, the fires of the mountains themselves, rivers of molten stone and choking ash. Each stage was designed to prove or disprove the human's claim that such things could be faced, endured, and survived. As the first simulation began, the chamber darkened and the roar of thunder filled the air. Lightning split the false sky, winds howled, and rain slammed down in torrents. The cadets gasped as they saw the human brace himself, leaning into the gale, his stance firm. He moved step by step through the storm, not unscathed but unbroken. He raised his arms once as though defying the sky itself, and laughter again carried through the chamber, sharp and unsettling. When the storm ended, the human stood dripping but upright, his chest rising with steady breath. The quake came next. The ground split and buckled, throwing him to his knees, yet he rolled and found his balance again. He spread his arms for balance and moved across the broken terrain like one who had learned long ago that the ground itself could not be trusted. The cadets who had scoffed now watched in silence, for they knew most of them would already have been crushed. When the predators emerged from the simulation fog, jaws wide and eyes glowing, many cadets recoiled in their seats. The human did not run. He picked up a length of simulated stone, gripped it like a spear, and faced the beasts with calm determination. He did not kill them, for the simulation ended before the fight reached its peak, but his stance alone revealed that he did not see himself as prey. Finally came the fire. The mountain erupted, ash filling the air, rivers of molten stone coursing down the slopes. The heat shimmered across the chamber, and many cadets felt panic even though they were safe behind the barrier. The human raised a hand to shield his eyes, coughed against the smoke, and walked forward as though he had done so before. His uniform scorched, his breath ragged, yet still he pressed on. When the chamber finally cleared, the human stood alone in the silence, marked by the trial but unbroken. His calm eyes lifted toward the council, and without a word he proved what no myth could. Earth had forged survivors, and its children would never bow to fear. The trial. The silence that followed the end of the trial stretched like a vast void through the dome. The human stood in the middle of the chamber, his uniform scorched, his hair damp with sweat, and his breathing heavy but steady. Around him, the simulated landscape faded into nothingness, leaving only the smooth silver of the arena floor. The cadets in the seats above stared down in wide-eyed disbelief, some with awe, some with fear, and some with a quiet reverence they did not yet understand. The counselors shifted uneasily on the dais, their authority shaken by what they had just witnessed. The professor, who had once spoken of Earth as myth, now stared at the young man as if he were staring into the heart of the very world itself. The first to break the silence was not a teacher nor a counselor, but a cadet. The Zirath noble, who had earlier mocked the human, now rose to his feet and demanded to know if trickery had been used. His voice carried anger, but beneath it trembled something close to fear. He declared that the simulations were flawed, that no cadet should have endured storms, quakes, predators, and fire without breaking. His words carried through the dome, but they rang hollow. The others had seen what he had seen, and no denial could erase the image of the human laughing into the teeth of the storm or standing, unyielding before rivers of molten rock. The cool professor silenced the noble with a single sharp word and then addressed the human directly. He asked how it was possible, how one being could move through such trials without faltering where every other species would crumble. The human answered simply that he had done nothing extraordinary. He said that every stage of the trial had reminded him of home. The storm felt like the ones that lashed his coasts each season. The quake was no more violent than the tremors his people had endured for centuries. The predators were larger than most, but their eyes and fangs were familiar. Shadows of beasts his ancestors had fought with fire and stone. The fire from the mountain was fierce, but he had seen skies black with ash before. What the Academy called trial, he called memory, and that difference was the reason he had endured. The cadets whispered among themselves, and the whispers this time carried not scorn but something heavier. They spoke of how their own worlds would crumble under even one of those trials, how their families could not imagine such relentless danger, how no civilization could rise from so much chaos. Yet before their eyes stood one who had risen, and not merely risen but laughed. That laughter haunted them now, for it was not the laugh of madness but of a being so familiar with danger that it seemed trivial. The counselor with the crest of the Taral species finally stood and asked if humanity feared nothing at all. The human shook his head and said of course his people felt fear, for fear was natural. They feared storms, they feared beasts, they feared fire. But fear alone was never enough to stop them. Fear taught them caution but never surrender. They learned to live alongside their fears, to build in spite of them, to fight through them. He said that it was not the absence of fear that made his kind strong, but the refusal to bow to it. The chamber grew quiet again as the truth of his words sank deep. The cadets who had once seen him as a curiosity now looked upon him as something different, not a student like themselves, but a window into a species that had been hardened in ways they could not imagine. Some felt admiration, others dread, and some a strange mixture of both. The insectoid Zarek lowered her gaze, her mandibles clattering softly as she muttered that if one human cadet could endure this, then what could an army do? The Relari wrapped its frills close around its neck as though trying to protect itself from a threat that was not yet real, but loomed nonetheless. The council ended the trial, declaring that the human had proven his claim. The professor's voice was firm but subdued as he dismissed the cadets, yet no one moved quickly to leave. They filed out in silence, glancing back at the human who remained in the chamber, calm and unmoved, as though trials of storm and fire were no more remarkable than a walk across the academy grounds. That image would stay with them for the rest of their lives. By the next cycle, the story had spread beyond the academy walls. Ships carried whispers to other stations, and soon the tale of the laughing human reached ears across the sector. Worlds that had never thought of Earth now spoke its name in hushed tones. Leaders debated whether such beings should be feared, studied, or sought as allies. The myth of Earth was no longer a warning told in classrooms. It was flesh, blood, and laughter, and it walked among them with steady steps. The trial meant to humble the human had instead humbled the galaxy. The laugh that changed minds, the air in the academy was thick with anticipation as the human walked through the central courtyard. The cadets who had once whispered behind his back and speculated about the myths of Earth now watched him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Every step he took carried a confidence born not of arrogance but of certainty, a certainty that came from knowing the world would bend to no one except those willing to endure it. The faculty gathered. The counselors aligned themselves with stiff backs, and even the most skeptical cadets could not hide their curiosity. The human's presence demanded attention, and the silence that followed was almost tangible, like a held breath across a continent of species. The professor, still trying to reconcile the reality of what had happened, stepped forward. His eyes scanned the human, searching for some trick, some flaw that could explain the impossible. "You survived the trial," he said, voice steady, but trembling slightly. "But why did you laugh?" The question rippled through the gathered crowd, for no one had heard a sound so disarming during the trial. The laughter had been more than a reaction. It had been a statement, a challenge, and a revelation all at once. The human smiled, not arrogantly, but simply, as if the question itself was absurd. "I laughed," he began, "because I understood what fear is and what it teaches. I laughed because the trials you constructed were meant to test strength, but they could not test the spirit. They could not touch the memory of home, the lessons passed down from those who came before. They could not understand endurance born from centuries of surviving when all odds were against us. I laughed because your fear of failure is different from ours. Your limits are different from ours, and I wanted you to see it." His words were calm, measured, yet carried a weight that seemed to press against every wall, every ear, and every mind present. The cadets shifted uncomfortably. Some tried to hide it, some tried to argue, but deep inside they all felt the truth of his statement. This was no ordinary being. This was someone who carried a history of survival, a lifetime of training born, not in classrooms but in the crucible of a world that had refused to give up. And yet there was something more unsettling than his strength. It was the laughter itself, an emblem of fearlessness and understanding that undermined every assumption the academy had held about life, survival, and power. A Xeric cadet, her mandibles twitching nervously, finally broke the silence. If one human can endure this, if one human can laugh at firestorms and predators, what then of an entire people? The question, simple in words, resonated with a terrible clarity. The laughter had been a signal, a message that survival was not just measured in strength but in spirit, in history, and in the refusal to bow to adversity. Across the courtyard, whispers began to rise, first among the cadets, then among the faculty, and finally reaching even the counselors who had thought themselves unshakable. The human continued, voice firm. "We are not invincible, but we do not surrender. Fear does not dictate our actions. It informs them. The trials you set were formidable, but they were familiar to us. We have faced worlds of fire, seas of chaos, and creatures that would have broken others before the first dawn. You asked us to endure, and we did, not because we do not feel, but because we cannot be broken by trials meant to test only the mind and body while ignoring the spirit. That is why I laughed. That is why you should understand that myths are not merely stories, they are warnings shaped by truth, and Earth is no myth." The counselors exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that the human's words carried implications far beyond the academy walls. This laughter, once dismissed as pride, was now a demonstration of a species whose potential had been underestimated. Across the sector, leaders and soldiers alike would hear of this, and they would recalibrate their assumptions about humans and the worlds they came from. Even the professor lowered his head in acknowledgement, the skepticism replaced with a grudging respect. The human's laughter had pierced the arrogance of centuries, had shown that strength was more than muscle or technology, and that endurance was built from history, hardship, and a refusal to yield. The cadets filed past him to leave, carrying with them a story that would be told for generations. They would tell of the trials and of the human who faced them and laughed, and in that laughter, the galaxy would learn to measure humanity not by its size or number, but by the fire that burned in its spirit. The human stood alone for a moment, eyes scanning the horizon beyond the academy domes, a faint smile on his lips, knowing that the laughter was only the beginning. A beginning of change, of realization, and of a universe that would never see Earth or its people the same way again. The echo of that laughter would linger in minds, a reminder that the underestimated could endure, and the impossible could be met with a simple human smile. The echo of laughter. The human walked through the corridors of the academy as the light from the twin suns streamed through the crystalline windows, illuminating the faces of those who had doubted him, and even now could not look away. His steps were steady and calm, carrying a presence that seemed to bend the air around him. The whispers that had begun as fear now turned into a mixture of awe and uncertainty, for the students and instructors alike could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, and the simple truth that one human had challenged the lessons they had learned for generations. He paused at the central hall where the statues of past conquerors and legendary scholars towered over the assembled crowd. The cadets who had once mocked the tales of Earth now watched in silence, unsure of how to react to someone who had not only endured the impossible, but had done so with a confidence that seemed effortless. The human raised his hand in a small gesture that was both acknowledgement and reassurance, and yet the room held its breath for the words that would come next. The voice of the human carried clearly through the hall, resonating in the hearts of those who had listened carefully. You believed that Earth's mountains bled fire, that our rivers boiled, that our skies raged endlessly. And yet here, I stand and laugh, not because I am stronger than the stories told, but because I have lived them and they did not break me. I have seen the heat that turns stone to ash. I have felt the storms that tear trees from the ground. I have known the predators that hunger endlessly, and still I endure, and still I walk forward, and still I laugh. The words hung in the air like a challenge and a revelation at once, and even the most stoic instructors felt the tremor of truth pass through them. The students shifted uneasily, realizing that the human had not just survived, but had rewritten the boundaries of what was thought possible. The laughter that had echoed across the training grounds before now seemed to resonate in their minds, shaping an understanding that endurance was not measured by fearlessness alone, but by the courage to face everything that could destroy you and continue to stand. The human's eyes scanned the room, and in them shone the reflection of countless worlds endured, countless trials faced, and countless victories achieved quietly and without boasting. A young cadet from the back raised her voice, trembling, but determined. What then do we learn from you? And the human smiled softly, the kind of smile that carried warmth, but also a weight of experience that few could comprehend. You learn that stories carry truth, but they are never complete. You learn that fear is a teacher, and not a jailer. You learn that the impossible is only impossible until someone dares to challenge it, and you learn that laughter is not weakness, it is strength. It is the declaration that no matter how hard the world strikes you, it cannot take the human spirit from you. The murmurs of understanding grew into a wave of realization that spread across the hall and through the academy as the truth of humanity's endurance sank in. The professors nodded slowly, the counselors whispered among themselves, and the cadets felt a fire ignite in their hearts, a fire of curiosity, wonder, and a new respect for a species they had dismissed for too long. The human turned away, finally leaving the hall, and as his figure faded into the sunlight streaming through the doors, the laughter returned, softly carried by the wind, a promise, a warning, and a legend all at once. The story of the human who laughed at the trials of firestorms and predators would spread through the galaxy, inspiring and challenging those who heard it. The lessons of endurance, courage, and the spirit that refused to break would be remembered and taught for generations. The laughter that began as a simple human reaction became a symbol, a testament to what it meant to endure, what it meant to live, and what it meant to stand when all odds were against you. End.